Hi, good morning, and first of all, thank you for everybody for coming out in such a beautiful, beautiful day. In Israel, we started saying Morid Hatal. We stopped saying Mashiv Haruach and Morid Hageshem. I think maybe you guys should stop that as well. I mean, it's a beautiful day. It feels just like Yom Ha'atzmaut, the weather in Israel. This is the same, Avirah that we have. It's a pleasure to be standing here this morning, especially for me. Because almost 25 years ago, my Ufruf was in this room, the old Or Torah. It was actually, I believe, according to Dodi, it was the last Simcha in Or Torah, in this building. And the last time I actually davened in this shul was the next day, was the day of my wedding. So that was almost 25 years ago. So that was it's very special to be back here with you. In addition to my introduction, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself, just in case you don't know who I am. I made Aliyah 20 years ago, just about 20 years ago. And more important than what I've done business-wise, I have 4 children, 3 boys who are currently all serving, all part of Yeshivot Hesder. 2 have completed their army service and now in their second state of service in the yeshiva. And a third son who just entered the army a little over a month ago, who is currently serving in the Nachal unit in the army. I have a daughter who's 17 years old who's finishing 11th grade. And I have my 3 boys, all were baseball players on the national team of Israel, which I can honestly say that if we had stayed in America, I don't think I would have had 3 sons play on the national team in America. And the most important thing about me is I myself have just completed my 3rd year of playing in the Maccabiyah in softball. And so I think it's very appropriate that, following someone like Rabbi Teller is for me like if I was called up to the majors and I had to follow Ernie Banks. I'm not a speaker. As you heard, I'm more in the business world, but I'll give it a shot. And I've been given the task of talking about the formation, a simple task of how the formation of a Jewish government came about, a modern Jewish government. Which is a simple task. And I just wanted to start out by talking about what was in existence in the state of in Eretz Yisrael before Hakamat Medina. Before that, we were a very homogeneous group at that time. We had the old Yishuv, which came in the 1700s, which was made up of Talmidei of the Gra mainly. They came to 4 places. To Jerusalem, Hebron, Tveria, and Sfat. And they were not there for Zionist reasons. Zionism, pretty much didn't exist at that point. They were there for spirituality, very poor. They were living and learning, and that's what the community was. Until about the 1880s, which was the first wave of Aliyah. And that wave came from Russia, and they were coming to build the utopian state. People who were leaving the pogroms of Russia and coming really wanted, probably early communists, they wanted to build this utopian agriculture society and build a society like that. And then came the 2nd and 3rd wave of Aliyah, which were also socialists, the people who started the kibbutzim, and many of the leaders of the early leaders, Ben-Gurion and his ilk. And then the 4th and 5th Aliyah, the 4th and 5th Aliyah came. And those were people who were leaving oppression of Europe. And those were people who were running away from the anti-Semitism that was engulfing Europe, including up until the Nazis that were taking over. And they weren't necessarily interested in going to kibbutzim. They were they were urban people. They were people who were educated, people who were leaving places like Warsaw, and who had already moved out from the shtetls. And they were people who built Tel Aviv. And built the cities and the urban lifestyle. And then on top of that, you had the people who were leaving the Arab countries, Jews that were now seeing that Eretz Yisrael is being built, and they were getting out of the Arab countries. And so all of a sudden, you had another cultural group that was coming in, and you had Ben Gurion and the laborists, and you had Begin and the revision, and the Irgun people, and we had a big chulent that was there, and all these people were coming for one purpose, and they were coming to try to build something, and it was, I would say, everybody got along great. Everybody believed in the same thing, and it was all collective good, and we were moving forward. And all these people had to come together and try to come up with the first thing, if they were building a country, is what's the country going to be? There were a lot of competing ideas out there. Was it going to be a halachic state? Was it going to be a utopian communist state? How were they going to function? And they really came out with three ideas of what was going to go, and they tried to synthesize them. And it was really the idea of balancing the halachic state with a democratic Jewish state. And what was that going to be? And what really happened in the end through Ben Gurion's leadership is he did a shiluv. He did a combination. And he said, we're going to be a democratic state. But we're going to be a democratic state that runs according to Jewish law in certain aspects. And it's going to run according to secular law in certain aspects. And we're going to try to combine all that together. And that's very easy to do. So that's what he decided to do. And it's also important to note that there were a lot of institutions. I know that this is a shock to people here in 2018, but Jews like institutions. They like organizations, and they don't even like a few organizations. Everybody likes their own organization, and that's really what existed. From the time that Herzl started with the Zionist Congress, we had diaspora organizations that were focused outside of the land of Israel. And there were organizations that were parallel in the state, in Eretz Israel, and they were functioning together. And that was what was ruling the land, because we were under first Turkish rule, and then after World War I, the British came in. And when the British came in, things changed, because when the British came in, we also had the Balfour Declaration, and we were on the path to statehood. We had been nobody really knew what was going on in the Yishuv, because the Turks weren't exactly interested in creating a Jewish country. But in 1917, when the Balfour Declaration occurred, we were on a path now to statehood. And that must have been, I can't even imagine what the euphoria must have been for people like Ben Gurion, people like Begin, who were working their entire life. Every ounce of their being was to create a new country, and all of a sudden they get this hechsher from the British. And what happened at that point is, in the Yishuv itself, in Eretz Israel, organizations started to form, quasi-governmental organizations that were working directly with the British. And they set up three ruling organizations. There was the Jewish National Council, which was like like the Knesset itself. And then there was the Assembly of Representatives, which was like the government within it. Of course, there were elections, and each of the different groups that were in Eretz Israel at the time got to elect people and have representatives. I think it started as 180 people, and it was eventually dwindled down to 120 people in this, what we'll call now the forerunner to the Knesset. And the third institution that was established was the Chief Rabbinate. And if you think back to who was running the Yishuv at the time, which was Ben Gurion, who was definitely not I would say he wasn't a religious Zionist. I would say he probably wouldn't consider himself a religious person. But it was because of Ben Gurion that many of the religious institutions got established in the country. Part of his desire to see a shiluv, a combination of the religious aspect of Judaism into this new state that came about. And there are two other very important organizations that were founded, which were important for once Hakamat HaMedinah happened, to get us off the ground and running. The other two were the Haganah, which was a forerunner to the Tzahal, and the last was the Histadrut, which was the Labor Federation, which gave us not only gave us a labor union, but also a lot of other services fell in that. The medical system, the tax system, all fell within that. So the Yishuv itself now, starting in 1917, in the 20s really, developed a quasi-government that interacted with the British. And so when Kaftet B'November happened in 1947, when the UN agreed to the establishment of the State of Israel, we were off and running. We didn't have to worry about anything. We had our institutions in place. And so that got us off the ground. But unlike other democratic countries that have been established since the 1800s, we had, even the United States in fact, our country was formed and the next day we went to war. In the United States, if we're all familiar, the revolution happened and then the country started. It was after the war that things got going. We started a country in crisis. We started a country in crisis. We had a major war going on. We had a huge wave of immigration coming in, mainly from the Arab countries at that point. And we had to sort of establish institutions. We had to establish a legal code. We had to establish a tax system, an education system, all that at the same time as fighting a war. And our wars really didn't stop, because once we finished with the War of Independence in 1949, we went to the next war. We went to the Sinai campaign, and then we went to 67. So we had some brief respites where we didn't have this threat of war hanging over our heads, and all the while we're absorbing hundreds of thousands of immigrants from very diverse cultures, and we're putting them all together and we're trying to make a society. And so how did that exactly get going? And that was, I would say, that was the genius of Ben-Gurion, who was able to come up with a concept which he called mamlachtiyut, which was a way to transition the diaspora mentality into a sovereign Jewish state mentality. And he had this idea that the diaspora mentality was very much groups of Jews were looking at their own interests. And we had to shift that from the collective good, that would be the interest of everyone. And of course that happened. Israel is a country now that everybody just looks at the collective good and nobody worries about their individual things. So he was really successful, and but I joke, but we're a very young country. 70 years we established a country, and that functions in a way that probably no other country in the world functions. If you think about 70 years ago, 600,000 people lived in the state of Israel at the time when the state was declared. We're now over 10 times that amount. Okay? We have become an economy that is probably second to none in the way that it runs. And our laws evolve as we go forward. We hit new things. Since we've been in Israel in 1998, okay, we moved to Israel in 1998. The week after we moved to Israel, a company called ICQ, I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It was the first instant messaging company. The week after we moved to Israel, ICQ got sold to AOL. And at the time, AOL was the biggest, right? It got sold for $500 million. That was a time to drink l'chaim. And everybody was drinking l'chaim, because that was an unbelievable event, okay? But with the high-tech revolution in Israel, things changed. All of a sudden, we went from this economy, right? Everybody said you have to have 2 jobs to live. Now, everybody was worrying about, what do I do with my stock options so I don't get taxed so much? And the Israeli government didn't catch on right away. They knew, they didn't, in the 90s, when people started giving stock to high-tech employees, the Israeli government had no way of taxing that. So you sold your stock options and you didn't have to pay tax on it. It was an amazing thing. And well, in 2000 they caught on and they said, okay, now we're going to figure out how to tax that. And they created a tax system for stock options, which didn't exist at that. Another example is, also in the tax realm, is Israelis weren't taxed on worldwide income. As an American citizen, you're taxed on worldwide income. So you can make money in Chicago, and you're taxed on that. You have to report that on your tax return. And you could own an apartment in Jerusalem, and you'll sell that apartment. But you actually have to report that in Israel, and you have to report that on your tax return. Up until 2004 in Israel, There was no such thing as worldwide income. So if you made money outside the state of Israel, which, as the rabbi can tell us, a lot of people did prior to 2004, that was your money. And as long as you didn't have to report that to Israel, you know, you reported it maybe to the US, you reported maybe if you lived in England, but you know, what stayed in your pocket stayed in your pocket. And then they changed that in that whole law. But my point is that the country, the establishment of the country occurred in such a fluid situation. We're a very fluid people, and the country itself is very fluid. And things are happening daily that change the way society runs. And it's amazing to see. It's only in the 1980s that the tax rates were almost, the highest level of tax was 80%. Today we've cut that down to about 55%. But that's fluidity. You know, that's the way the state of Israel runs. I often talk to my dad, and we often talk about Israeli politics. And he tells me two things usually. One is, your government is crazy. And the second thing he says, it's a miracle that you survive. And I can honestly say, yes, our government is crazy. Our government is made up of such a chulent of people. And our country is made up of a chulent of people. But that chulent, just like on a day like today, if we were eating chulent, would taste really good. That's what makes Israel really good. It's the diversity, it's the fact that even though Ben Gurion's idea of the collective good, we haven't quite got there yet, but we're getting there. And you know, certain things happen in Israel that show you that we're moving in the way. You know, they always used to say when you walk on the street with a young child, you know, when you're a young parent, all of a sudden everybody and their mother is the grandparent of the child. One person says you got to put on a hat, the other one says you got to take off the hat. But there is this collectiveness that really does permeate the society in Israel, and I think it's a very special thing. And that contributes to the establishment of norms and the way that the state functions, because we do function that way. I mean, just a little thing. Our legal system in Israel. America is based on a common law system, right? Something happens, we build on the law. In Israel, we also have a little bit of a common law system. But our legal system is based on, the first foundation is Turkish law, the second foundation is British law, the third foundation is halacha, and the fourth foundation is modern Israeli law. Now, if you want to go to buy a house in Israel, the first thing you have to do is look at the Turkish deeds. And then you have to look at the British deeds. And then you can get into the Israeli. So it's very fluid. It moves, and it keeps everybody interested. It's never boring or dull, as you know, in Israel. And the other thing that Ben Gurion did when he established the state, going back to Hakamat Medina, is he made sure that there were certain symbols and certain events that were instituted that were Jewish events, right? Our flag, right? The flag. What does the flag remind us of? Flag reminds me, it always reminded me of a talit, right? The blue was chosen, and the way the blue was chosen was to resemble tchelet. And that was very important, a very important Jewish symbol. Even though the first people that came up with it were not necessarily people who were religious. The idea that Shabbat was declared the day of rest in Israel. I once heard Rabbi Wein speak, and Rabbi Wein said the difference between living in Israel and living in America is not Shabbat, it's Erev Shabbat. Erev Shabbat in Israel is holy. You know, you can't run out at 4:30 to buy something in the grocery store. It doesn't exist. The grocery store is not open. Jewish holidays have become national holidays. The idea of the Rabbanut governing life cycle events, that is all things that have been codified into law in the country. All these, this is how the establishment of the country came about, both on the secular side and on the Jewish side. It's emerging. And that's where really the role of the religious Zionists come in at the forefront. Is as religious Zionists, we are in this kind of, I guess, at the tip of the triangle And we're moving it forward. And society, I think even in the 20 years that we've lived in Israel, society is moving towards the way the religious Zionist world is moving. I'm sure most of you know that the number of officers, religious Zionist officers in the army, is multiplying on a yearly basis. And it's an amazing thing to be at a tekes and to see the number of kippot in the officer corps. My son, Gidon, our middle son, recently finished the paratroopers in the Sanchanim. That was once the elite unit of the kibbutz world, not religious people. It was very hard for religious people to go in there. And I remember he told us a story that when you're on the base for Shabbat, they have dinner on Friday night. And they were a large group of Hesder boys that were in the Sanchanim. They were 30 boys together. And so Shabbat was Shabbat. It didn't matter if they were in the army or they're in yeshiva. They're going to make their Shabbat. And he told me the first week that they were in the army, they sat down, they made Kiddush, and everybody, and it's a funny thing that happens when the non-religious boys, or actually, I don't think they're non-religious boys, but the Masorati boys would come over and put their hands on their head or put a napkin on their head so that they would hear Kiddush and they'd sit with them. And then these 30 Hesder boys in a group of over 200 Sanchanim Chayalim, Zmirot Shabbat, it was time to sing. And lo and behold, instead of the other boys leaving the base, many of them pulled up and wanted to be part of this. And they wanted to feel the atmosphere. And it was no longer a situation where kids used to go to the army and become less religious because they had nothing. Here you had kids that were drawn to these boys. And they were drawn and they wanted to sing with them. They didn't know the songs. So the boys sang Am Yisrael Chai and other songs that these boys would know. So that they were drawn in. And that's what the religious Zionist world is doing. We're drawing people in as much as we can. We're trying to create less conflict. It's not about right, it's not about left. It's creating less conflict. And like Rabbi Cutler was saying, bringing people into the tent. And that's a great thing. And I remember, just as an aside, when Gidon had his Tekes Kumta, which is the end of their big walk. All the boys get together. They had walked, I think, 75 kilometers. And they can't walk too well during the tekes after walking 75 kilometers in their boots. But I remember they got together, and the whole group gets together, and all of a sudden they start singing Am Yisrael Chai. And that's the symbol of what we're doing. And that's how things are moving forward. So I'm not sure if I covered everything that I could to show you how the country is growing and how it gets established and how it moves forward. I do know that we're a moving target in Israel. We're not steady. Things change. When the Iron Curtain fell in 1990, we didn't say, oh, we'll take those Jews in about 5 years when we come up with the programs. It doesn't happen that way. When the Ethiopian Jews needed to get to Israel, it was 5 days, and they were in Israel. They didn't have anywhere to put them. And people say, oh, well, you don't have a plan. Well, sometimes you can't have a plan. When you form a state and the next day there's a war, you can't always have a plan. But if we look back on 70 years, and we can say, as my dad would say, it's a miracle that you guys function. It truly is. We live in miraculous times. And living in the state of Israel is living in a miracle. And I hope we never get to that point where we have to worry about the forms as opposed to just taking care of what needs to be taken care of, the same thing. So thank you very much. It's been a wonderful Shabbat and a wonderful weekend here. And